Hello, my name is Michelle. I am 17 years old. My story is about a broken heart and a tremendous amount of stress, which I experienced, and, as it seems to me, made me stronger. This is a story about the death of my online boyfriend and how it changed the future of two people. And I hope these changes will be for the better. For about 6 months, I had a long-distance relationship with a guy named Daniel. We met on the internet on a specific message board. It was an old-fashioned board where people still preferred to hide their real names behind nicknames, and real-life photos behind pretty pictures. Daniel and I started a conversation, which we continued in private. For a while, we were just chatting, until I began to share some very personal things with Dan. I began to trust this guy a lot. Perhaps even more than I trusted my friends in real life. At the same time, Daniel told me practically nothing about himself. I just knew that he and I both lived in Texas, but in different cities. I also knew that Dan was a little older than me, but this only made him more attractive for me. So far, every relationship with a guy of my age had ended disastrously for me. And I also liked the halo of mystery surrounding Daniel. He did not have a single account on the internet where he would show his real name or post his real photos. This I could easily relate to. Only 6 photos had appeared on my poor Instagram in 2 years. But Dan, for some reason, did not want to show me what he looked like, even in private messages. Nor did he want to meet with me in real life, or even just talk to me on Skype so that I could hear his voice. I was a little frustrated, but still did not perceive it as a problem. I thought that everything would happen when the timing was right. And it never occurred to me that Dan might not be who he seemed at all. I rather imagined that perhaps Dan was very ugly or unhealthy. I could only guess. But all of this was not important to me. For me, the inner world of a person really matters much more than their outer shell. Well, when I received a phone call from a number unknown to me, I saw no reason to not believe what a rather unpleasant female voice told me. The voice belonged to somebody named Danielle, and making sure that I was Michelle, she said that Dan had passed away. Danielle told me that she was Dan's twin sister, hence the similar names, and added that she knew about her brother's relationship with me. According to her, Dan had been terminally ill for quite a long time, and that was the reason he did not want to see me. But now, everything was over. He was dead. After that, Danielle hung up. I tried several times to call her back to at least find out the details, but she did not pick up the phone. This might seem strange, but I really was in love with Dan. Everything was real for me, so just imagine how you would feel if your boyfriend or girlfriend died. I sometimes read our chats and messengers, and of course, I saw that Dan never showed up as online again. But on the message board where we met, his account was online after Daniel's call. I sent Dan a message, but of course there was no answer. Later I thought that it was probably his sister, one of his friends, who was using Dan's laptop, and the message board page had simply opened by default. But I still could not get it out of my head. I wanted to know more. I only had Daniel's phone number, so I decided to start with searching it on the internet. Not really hoping for success, of course, but what if I got lucky? I used different search engines and web archives until finally I saw a match. This number was used in some pretty old ad for the sale of some junk on Craigslist. The announcement was clearly outdated, but it indicated a specific address for pickup. I had no other options. The next weekend, I went to the neighboring city to visit this address. There, I saw a rather ordinary house, not very large in size. I worked up all my courage and knocked on the door. I don't know what I was expecting, but definitely not what happened next. A child opened the door for me. But there was a boy who was about 12 who, seriously and even a little sternly, asked me who I was. Another boy, 5 years younger, peered out from behind him. I asked them to call an adult, when suddenly a short woman who was about 30 appeared and stood between the children and me. I recognized her voice. It sounded better live, but it was definitely the voice of Danielle. I introduced myself, and suddenly Danielle told me to leave. She looked nervous, spoke in a muffled voice, and looked around as if she was waiting for somebody. I did not say a word when an elderly man with a stern look came out of the house. In a very authoritative manner, he demanded that I introduce myself and explain what I needed. This man looked so menacing and aggressive that I was confused and could not clearly explain what I was doing at their door. Then the man demanded that I get off of his private property, and he literally pushed Danielle and the children inside the house. After that, he slammed the door right in front of my face. Well, I had nothing to do but to go back home. I think you've already come to the same conclusion as I have. I began to think that Dan had never existed. Daniel and Danielle? Seriously, who would give these names to twins? I don't know why this woman needed this, but when I realized that my story was a lie, my pain was gone. Better to be deceived than to mourn the death of a loved one. But that is not the end of the story. I received a call from Danielle again. This time she asked me to meet. She was at the railway station in my city and told me that she was waiting for me in the cafeteria at the station, and that she was extremely short on time. I doubted whether I should agree to meet, but decided to give her a chance to explain herself, so I could close this gestalt. We met. It was very strange to sit at the same table with Danielle, but the first thing she did was apologize to me. She confirmed all my guesses that it was her who was hiding behind Dan's name. Then Danielle asked me to not jump to conclusions that she was some kind of psycho seeking attention from girls on the internet. She was not even a lesbian, and in fact, she did not have any romantic feelings for me. Danielle reminded me that I was the one who took the first step in my relationship with Dan, and that was true. But I still did not understand why she needed to invent Dan, and asked for an explanation. Danielle stared at her cup of coffee, although before that she was not afraid to look into my eyes. And she said that it all started when she was 18 years old. At that time, she met the man who kicked me out of the house when I came to see her. Once, he seemed to Danielle to be good enough to fall in love with, marry, and even give birth to his child at such an early age. But later, she realized that she had made a serious mistake. Soon after their son was born, this man literally locked Danielle inside the house. He did not allow her to try to get a higher education. He was absolutely opposed to the idea of her getting at least a part-time job, and he forced Danielle to cut all her ties with her old friends. She could only communicate with her parents, and they were dense enough to believe that this attitude was good for Danielle. Danielle, of course, was thinking about getting a divorce, but she essentially had nowhere to go. And a few years later, her husband made Danielle give birth to another child. Of course, she hurriedly added, she loves her second son and does not regret that he was born, but this was not her decision. Her husband decided absolutely everything for Danielle. This woman told me directly that she was really afraid of her husband, but I had already seen that for myself. I saw a woman who, for many years, was subjected to at least psychological abuse, and Danielle invented Daniel in order to have the illusion of a life and self-confidence, at least on the internet. It was the only place where her husband did not poke his nose, but still, to be on the safe side, Danielle had chosen a male alter ego. Moreover, according to her logic, a man would never end up in the situation in which she, a woman, found herself. I think that when I realized that Danielle was simply solving her psychological problems at my expense, I was finally ready to forgive her and let this story go. I felt sorry for her. I clearly understood this when I saw how meticulously Danielle kept track of time, as if she was afraid to miss the train and arouse the suspicion and anger of her husband. I could not forget this conversation at the station. It touched me really deeply. A week later, I gathered my courage and told my mother almost everything, except that my acquaintance with Danielle began as a virtual romance. And my mother immediately understood how serious the situation was, and said that we should help Danielle. I was thinking the exact same thing! We did not know whether Danielle's husband controlled her phone calls and text messages. So I sent her something like a formal invitation to the forum where we met, when she was pretending that she was Dan. Danielle understood everything and logged in. Then I let my mother talk to her. Danielle was no longer posing as a guy, so my mother did not have any questions. They exchanged messages for about an hour, and my mother found the right words to convince Danielle to take her children and flee from her husband. We waited for an opportunity for several months, and once, when Danielle's husband was not at home, we arrived in our car and took Danielle, along with the boys and a minimum of their belongings. She is now in a shelter for women who are victims of domestic violence.